My name is Rob, and I'm the campaigns manager for Shelter Cymru. Still fairly new, still finding my feet a little bit, but I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour on Shelter Cymru's work on the affordability of homes in Wales, and also just some of the specific Welsh context that we've heard from some of the sessions earlier today already. So, provided everything works here. Brilliant. So the first thing we're going to do is, on the right-hand side, there will be a poll, hopefully, coming up soon. And what I want to do is just take a quick temperature check of the virtual room that we're in and find out what immediately comes to mind to you, the delegates, when you think of the housing emergency in Wales. And I appreciate this might be a little bit skewed scientifically, given we've just had an amazing session on generation rent. So if that suddenly bumps up in the polls, then there's probably a reason behind that. If there's nothing in there that particularly comes to your mind, then put it in the chat and we can keep a tab on it as we go through. So I'm just checking to make sure that that has gone through. It looks like it's all working. So if we just keep on the poll section there, I'll give people a quick moment to sort that out and I will then crack on. Just to caveat this immediately, I've got a very talkative dog who is currently scuttling around behind me. So if anyone hears any screaming, then apologies in advance. Okay, so the Wales context at a glance. Now, I'm going to caveat this immediately by saying that this shortlist here at a very high level is by no means exhaustive, and I think probably points to the nebulous sort of nature of the crisis that's going on at the moment as well. So, as we've seen, there are some of the sort of issues that we talked about already: generation rent, barriers to ownership, social housing, which is quite a sort of pertinent issue at the moment in Wales. Second homes has been quite prevalent as well, particularly around the honeypot sites and more rural parts of Wales. As has been mentioned already, temporary accommodation. Before the pandemic, we were seeing significantly reduced numbers in temporary accommodation to what we're seeing now. And we've obviously had commitments that there will be no return to the streets in the way things were by the minister. And we need to find those sustainable long-term solutions for people in that predicament as well. And obviously then land prices has been spoken about, and finally a culture which can feel quite opaque, complex and adversarial, particularly with planning and that whole kind of dynamic with NIMBYism. So these are some of the sort of contextual issues that we're seeing at the moment at a bit of a glance. So I think, what is clear to see from this very short list at a very high level is that the housing emergency in Wales is certainly widespread. It's multifaceted. And as mentioned by Ruth earlier and in our research, it's impacting on over 1 million people in Wales, as we know of, in many different ways, and often dependent on who you are and where you were, the effects are very different as well. So anyone who knows me will know that I enjoy memes on the internet, so I thought I would sneak a couple into this presentation as well. This is what sometimes to us it feels like the housing emergency can be like a little bit, and anyone who follows Dominic Cummings will know that he enjoys this as well, so I don't know what that says about me, but I'll continue. Given the particularly emotive nature of the housing emergency, it can sometimes feel like all these different issues and all these different sort of pressure groups and peer groups are perhaps sometimes blaming one another, and without any real sort of malice or horrible intent, they're doing quite a lot of work to try and make sure that the particular issue that affects and impacts on them personally, their families and their communities, are pushed right to the very top of the agenda to be solved. And obviously anyone can tell you that that's probably not a great environment to be in, not conducive to solving some of the issues that we all face, as Wales in the midst of a housing emergency. So what we'll do is we'll move on quickly and cover off just a couple of the key areas that we found coming through, and the Wales context. We'll look at, sort of the issues that there are, and then some of the perhaps mooted solutions that there might be over the course of the next Senedd term as well. And we'll start with this one. This is definitely coincidental and not at all pre-planned. And I want to declare my conflict of interest on this immediately as an avocado-eating, coffee-drinking millennial member of Generation Rent. But as we've already heard this morning, we know that for a certain demographic, Generation Rent is sort of stereotyped as millennials and Gen Z, but actually, we're talking about people here up to and around about 40 years old. So it's not just your people that perhaps look like me. So inflated house prices have been a long-standing barrier, and has obviously been exacerbated recently by just a buoyant housing market, which again, as Chloe just said, was not probably something that we expected. Adding to that, the Resolution Foundation has done some research and found that there's the scarring on the salaries of people who entered the workforce around about 2008, which is obviously during the last financial crisis. And actually, wages haven't recovered for this group of people and for this particular generation. And what we do know is that that particular generation, again, millennials, Gen Z, often work disproportionately in less secure, less well-paid work. And we know that currently they've been disproportionately adversely affected by the COVID crisis and are likely to be disproportionately affected in a negative manner again by any further impacts. So, thinking of the tapering off of furlough, the stuff that we're going to see there is probably likely to have a significant impact on the, sort of on generation rent's ability to escape this predicament that we're in. And so going on to some of the, the mooted solutions, there was an acceptance of a housing crisis by the Minister for Climate Change, who we'll hear from tomorrow during the debate last month in the Senate on housing policy, and quite, a clear and open communication across the chamber that this is something that the Welsh Government are prepared to work on cross-party and collaboratively. I think the line was used, that Welsh Labour do not have a monopoly on the good ideas to resolve this issue. In terms of commitments from Welsh Labour's manifesto, again, as has been spoken about, there was a significant commitment to social house building with 20,000 low-carbon social homes, and also rent restrictions in there as well. And then I think perhaps not solutions, but issues that might need to be resolved, and we'll see turned into some sort of solutions down the line. Section 21 evictions have been coming up frequently more recently. We know that there was quite a significant debate on whether or not these should be banned outright, and compromise was reached. But will this debate be reignited over the course of the 6th Senedd? We remain to see. And then equally, the arrears crisis, which was, we welcome the announcement of the tenancy hardship grant. I've been rehearsing that all morning, I still can't say it properly, which we pushed, significantly for over the last few months. So it's great to see that, and we wait to see the impact that will have on addressing that crisis. Naturally, the eviction ban and PRS has just been lifted. We know that in our casework, Section 21 evictions are significantly higher than they were at this point last year. We know that if we're heading into another wave, I've lost count of how many waves this is now, of infections later in the year, is this something that needs to be revisited? And then something that's come up quite frequently over the last few months for us, and I'm sure other people are seeing as well, is this issue of significant amounts of rent up front, which is acting as in a similar manner as a barrier to the PRS, as inflated deposits are to people getting in, to buy in their own home. So just last week, actually, one of our caseworkers was helping someone who had been quoted nearly £10,000 up front for 12 months worth of rent to get into the private rented sector. So again, these are some of the issues that might need solving over the course of the next coming months or years. So this one will be familiar to some of the perhaps older heads in the audience. Shelter Cymru ran a campaign called My ENT and Ddigon, which is One House is Enough. So we know that obviously second homes has been quite prevalent in the press and media recently, and has generated quite a lot of noise outside of and inside the Senedd chamber. And so what I want to draw your attention to on this particular slide is the image on the right-hand side. Now, this is from Principalities Wales House Price Index from Q3 of 2020. It might be a bit small, so what I'll do is I'll just unpick the bits that I want to point you to. So what you can see on there is that for this particular quarter in Gwynedd, which is obviously one of the key touristy areas and most affected by the second homes issue at the moment, is in that particular quarter, there was a 14.6% increase in house prices, which is clearly not insignificant. And you can see there are similar increases in places like Pembrokeshire and Carmarthenshire as well, which again are sort of quite closely related to second homes and touristy areas. Now, we know that obviously this is presenting significant issues as local salaries aren't able to keep up with this inflation. And we expect that actually there might be accelerating effects, due to COVID-19, people being able to work remotely, wanting to live somewhere that's perhaps a bit quieter with more space, and this exodus from, sort of commercial hubs. And also actually the UK's decision to leave the European Union could have another compounding effect on this, where we know people who have second homes in the European Union will not be able to use them in the same way that they have done in the past. And this will probably prompt some sort of move towards, as the Telegraph calls them, bolt holes in the UK. And again, like that presents some issues for people living in those communities being gentrified and priced out. And the important thing to note on this one as well is the particular impact this has on the Welsh language and Welsh culture. We know that the areas that are most affected by these issues are disproportionately Welsh speaking, and this has an additional impact and dynamic on this particular issue. So in terms of what sort of some of the mooted solutions are, again, there's significant cross-cabinet and cross-party support on this. The Minister for Education and the Welsh Language, Jeremy Miles, has been quite vocal and outspoken on this, and it obviously sees it as an issue within his remit to solve. And then obviously there's been quite a significant debate on this in the Senedd as well from Plaid Cymru and their spokesperson, who we'll hear from later today, Mabon Gwynfor. So in terms of commitments, we've seen commitments from Welsh Labour in their manifesto to keep the 1% increase on the land transaction tax for second home purchases. And we've also seen and are expecting imminently the Welsh Language Communities Housing Plan, which has been referred to significantly as well. Plaid Cymru's manifesto was perhaps unsurprisingly more expansive on this, ranging from everything from caps to second homes and pilots to bring them back into the community and all manner of different things. One of the significant documents in Wales for this debate is the report by Dr. Simon Brooks, and his report contains 10 recommendations which explore everything from planning policy through to taxation reform, and put a significant emphasis on greater clarity and understanding of this issue, sort of to the point of how do we define a second home? And actually, the very timely announcement yesterday of the Welsh Government's approach to tackle this, the three-pronged approach, does call a lot on this report, and we see significant stuff reflected in there into the Welsh Government's work too. So, I'd lost my mouse there for a minute. This is probably perhaps no surprise given the previous session. But yeah, whether Mark Twain did or did not say this, and there seems to be some serious debate on the internet as to whether he did, by land, they aren't making it anymore. The graph you can see there, the dark blue line is land price index, and the pink line is house price index. You can quite clearly see there, and you don't need me to explain it to anybody, that there's a significant correlation between the two lines. And we know that land prices, drive residential prices. And as mentioned earlier, the value of residential property has overtaken the use of land for other purposes. And actually, or for all intents and purposes, this could well be exacerbated by COVID as people move out of these commercial hubs. Will the commercial use for land continue to decrease and be outpaced by residential land as people sort of scatter in a sort of less dense manner populationally. And then again, there's significant thought on this about whether or not the perception of how we have economically perceived land is fit for purpose now, and whether it has been fit for purpose at all in the first place. Again, land is speculative investment. There's a lot of thought trains going around now that suggest that actually it's probably long past time to move away from that and view land for the fundamental asset that it is. And so, turning to some of the solutions, there's not a huge amount. To be honest, I don't know whether that reflects the complexity of the issue, but yes, certainly in May's elections for the Senedd, this was an area that was noticeably less covered compared to everywhere else. So there is a commitment in the programme for government on community land trusts and the Welsh Government's commitment to support and try and expand on that work. And there were several significant suggestions in Plaid Cymru's manifesto as well. But otherwise, yeah, no real devolved movers and shakers in this space at the moment, and perhaps that is a bit of a call to action for us, really. The Land for the Many report, which was obviously commissioned for the Labour Party in 2019, we'll hear far more about that later from people with far more experience and ability to communicate that more eloquently than me. But some proposals in there, within a Wales context around changing the view of land, tax reform, transparency, and again, some of that keeps coming up to us is democratizing and sort of destigmatizing this planning and development process. Again, trying to remove that adversarial nature of planning. So, with all of this in mind, and I promise after this there are no more memes. What next? How do we in Wales, as a housing sector, and just a wider nation, move from this sort of image on the left of everyone divided to this image on the right hand side? And I'm not even going to go into how long it took me to try and find these two online. Not acceptable. But how do we move from this left to this right, where everybody reflects on the fact that actually we're in a very similar or the same boat, and unless we come together and work together as one, actually the inroads that we're going to make into the housing emergency are going to be quite sort of minimal. So with that in mind, we think there's a real space for unity on this issue. A lot of the issues that we've highlighted today, which again, caveat, were very much not exhaustive, are sort of symptoms rather than causes, and all contribute to the wider housing emergency. Many of the sort of issues that we've noted today share similar solutions and will require a lot of overlap to be solved. But I think one of the important things that I want to raise to this particular audience is the issue of privilege. I think anybody could be forgiven if they sort of weren't part of the housing sector to think that some of the housing issues more recently focus around sort of millennials and Gen Z breaking into the home ownership market and second homes. And actually, without many of the organisations that we see represented here today, issues like rough sleeping and hidden homelessness and the significant strains on temporary accommodation perhaps wouldn't be heard and might fly a bit more under the radar. And so I think it's quite important that, for me, incredibly frustrated by the housing market and paying my rent, we're not being able to afford to buy somewhere. You need to recognise that actually it could be worse, and that's a key part of solving the housing emergency is really lifting everyone up and working together. And again, bringing the experts in back bringing the experts in with people who have lived experience would be absolutely key to solving the housing crisis. And building on that unity, bringing people together, and that cross-party consensus at a local, devolved and reserved level, because the consensus is there and the common ground is there. We've just got to put the people in the space and find it and run with it to an extent. And so lastly, and this will be the brief slide, where does Shelter Cymru fit in? So we're soon to be launching a consultation or a survey to gather the experiences of people in Wales impacted by the housing emergency, of which we know there are definitely many. Once we've done this, we'll be forming a commission, which will be packed with policy wonks and also people with lived experience to try and bring about that conversation and consensus on the housing emergency. And then we hope to generate some recommendations based on these two factors to start making some inroads as well. And with that, that is me, and I open for any questions as well. So if anyone has any, then feel free. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully that works now. There we go. So I'm just going to check the chats now. And actually, I don't know if people can see the poll as well, but yeah, rough sleep and homelessness, it tops that significantly. Hello, Shane, sorry.
No, that's okay, Rob. Did you want to pick up any of the points in the Q&A, or we're almost on time, really?
Grand. I can certainly pick up. The Q&A is just loading for me.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see a question there. I think I expanded a little bit on the accelerating impacts on Brexit and COVID. The one about opaque and adversarial cultures. Actually, you know what? My dad's guilty of this, bless him. He's recently just put his house up for sale to relocate somewhere. And he's got a letter through the door, and his neighbour had got a planning permission in that was going to encroach over one of his windows. And instead of going around for a chat, put in an objection. So this is what I mean. Sort of that stigmatized approach of not bringing people together and having, these conversations, I think is part of that, and democratizing that planning process, actually making it accessible for people, because until I started working in the housing sector, I would have not known the first place to go. So I think, bringing people in who haven't got this experience and that sort of, tunnel vision and the policy expertise to be part of that and break down those barriers, I think would be key.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's one of those odd things that everybody has such a strong view on so many of those issues, and yet we don't come together often enough. And I think your final bit around Shelter Cymru's role to bring together a commission, that we start having those honest conversations about how we all feel. We all have a vested interest in this to some extent, so I think that's really welcome. Okay, thank you very much, Rob.